Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. My name is Frank Gavin. I'm the director of the Kissinger Center of Global Affairs at SAIS Johns Hopkins, and we're delighted today to welcome Joseph Nye, professor at Harvard and the author of a terrific new memoir, A Life in the American Century, which was just published a few months ago and is absolutely terrific. And I'm thrilled to be here with you today, Joe, to talk about this book.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
First question I wanted to ask you, there's so much that we could cover in this fascinating account, but maybe you could tell me a bit about what motivated the book. I was thinking, as reading it, scholars were often encouraged to sort of take third person Archimedean perspective to sort of move away from the first person view, which I always kind of think is unfortunate. That's why I really liked your book. And I wondered maybe if you could talk about A, what motivated this book, and then B, what do you think you can accomplish in this kind of more personal writing than in the kind of more traditional academic work that you do?
It is a little bit different from what I'm used to. If you use the analogy of telescope, usually as academics, we're trained to look through the telescope the right way, to describe the meadow or see the meadow in as broadly as we can. But if you take the telescope and turn it around, all of a sudden you're focusing on a few dewdrops on one or two blades of grass. And both perspectives are interesting. I had already written a book in 2015 called Is the American Century Over?, which was a traditional academic broad perspective. But it seemed to me that doing something is a life in the American century was like turning that telescope around and saying, what did it feel like? What was it like to actually live through this? And it may be of some use to some historians who are going to someday do more traditional work about the period. But it was also an exercise in a sense of looking at something with which I was familiar, but from a different perspective.
So I love that idea, that image of the telescope. And it makes me think that we once had a more robust tradition of these types of memoirs that were both personal, but that connected to the larger historical themes of our time. Was there a memoir, an autobiography, a book that perhaps influenced you, that shaped this, or was a model, or one that you thought, well, this is in that tradition?
I didn't have a template in mind. Obviously, given my professional background, read a lot of memoirs. One of the things that worried me about writing a memoir is the danger of sort of a golden glow or a gilding of the past. And a lot of the memoirs I'd read were full of, I won't call them exaggerations, but slants that made things look different than perhaps they were. And I wanted to make sure that I could try to avoid that. So I had the benefit of having kept diaries through this period, including State Department and National Intelligence Council and the Pentagon. And that kept me honest, or it helped to keep me honest, in the sense that sometimes I'd remember something and then you read it in the diary and it wasn't exactly like that.
As a historian, I can tell you I'm thrilled when I was reading and realizing that were keeping track of these things that happened day to day. And it's a habit that I think we should be encouraging more people to do. Is how did you come upon deciding to keep a diary and keeping it up like that, which takes a certain amount of dedication and discipline?
On the eve of my going into the Carter administration in 76, one of my sons gave me a Christmas present, which was a simple little diary that he bought at the local Five and Dime. And it was a 5-line diary. And so I started keeping it sort of to fill the obligation of the reciprocity of having received the gift. Then I realized I couldn't do it in 5 lines. There was too much flowing over, and a lot of it was pretty interesting. So I went out and I got a full-size booklet. And the hardest thing was after you've been either traveling or testifying on the Hill or at meetings all day long before you go to bed at night to discipline yourself to fill out that diary. But once you get started, the idea of having gaps led me to say, well, I've got to stay awake enough to get this down.
That's such a wonderful, that's a great story. And it's wonderful that you did that. And it reminds me too, something that's truly magical about a book like this is that to an extent, I don't think you probably fully recognize you are looked at as a sort of an intellectual hero for generations. You've had such an enormous influence. And I think for young people who encounter you through your great ideas and your scholarship, or perhaps in government service or in leadership at universities, to actually see the human being behind there, a human being with their own particular history and past and decisions, it's really remarkable. And I think that that's probably one of the truly positive things about a book like this, that some student who encounters something great that you've written and then reads this and realizes, wow, that there's nothing that prevents them from being just like you. It's another really great reason to do something like this. I mean, was that your goal when you sort of mixed in the personal with the sort of professional, or what were you sort of thinking?
I think the hard thing about this is you don't want to, writing this type of book, is you don't want to overdo the personal, but you also want to personalize enough that you can draw the reader into what it felt like at the time, and keeping that balance of the personal and the professional, or if not professional, but the description of social sciencey type things. I was conscious of trying to get that in balance. Sometimes I got it right, sometimes I got it wrong. But I thought that, following up what you were just saying, that younger scholars who wanted to have a time in government would learn something about the differences of government and academia by reading this, and that would give them a better understanding of what it's like. The danger, of course, is that it all looks so rational and clear at the end, and in fact, that's not the way it feels. Life is clearer in the rear view mirror than when the windshield wipers are changing against a splattering rain. So I wanted to give a sense of how do you combine that view, looking ahead and looking behind at the same time.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, and I want to get to how you've brought these two worlds of the mind and practice together. But I had obviously, been a big fan of yours forever. But one of the great things about the book is to talk about your passion for fishing, and I had heard about these mysterious fly fishing trips that had a very cabal, conspiratorial sort of sounding, with you and the masters of the universe, some of our mutual friends, David Sanger, Jim Steinberg, people like that would go off and fish and decide the fate of the world. And, I'm looking, there's this great picture of you with your sons in 1988 fishing. And it's just, you wanted to go fishing. It was your great hobby and your great passion. And you wanted to introduce your friends to fishing. And there's something kind of just really endearing about that, and that this was something that you did and you shared, that you and your friends would get together, and just so happened some of your friends happen to be pretty important thinkers and doers, but it didn't have this kind of mysterious, all the fly fishermen were getting together where no one can reach them or hear them and decide the fate of the world.
Well, my wife says that fly fishing is absolutely nuts. She said, you're matching your intellect against this creature that has a brain the size of a pea. And my response to that is, you'd be surprised how many times the fish wins. The most intriguing were these trips to Alaska, which were you'd fly out to a wilderness lake in a float plane. They'd drop you off, and you'd float for a week down to either a big river or the sea. And that started when Graham Allison and I had been at a Shimoda conference in Japan. And when we were flying back in those days, the planes didn't have long legs, and the Pan Am flight would refuel in Anchorage. And I said, Graham, this is crazy. We're flying over some of the best fishing in the world. Why don't we stop and break the trip for a couple of days and go fishing? So we did. And it was so fabulous that the next year we said, why do we bother with Japan? And so we've tended to do it almost annually afterwards.
That's absolutely wonderful. And that is another thing that comes through in your book that I think is really good for young people to see is that you've developed these lifelong relationships that are professional and intellectual, but actually become friendships, like your relationship with Graham and people like that, which is, I think we have a tendency, young people do, to see these worlds as very competitive, and they are. Everyone's very, very smart. But I think one thing that came through in the book is it reminded me a bit actually of Bill Burns's memoir, even though it could be sharp about particular issues. It was very kind towards people. You obviously have a sort of a human warmth that really comes through in these relationships and these friendships that are both professional but also personal. And I think that's an incredibly important thing for young people to see. I mean, I'm talking to you from Washington, D.C., where sometimes the personal and professional is very difficult to mix. So I think that's one of the, you're really to be commended. It just shows what kind of person you are, that it's very clear by the end of this that it's the relationships you have with people, the friendships that you form, that's the most important part of your incredibly distinguished career.
In one of the chapters in the book, I described, I think it was after I was doing the nonproliferation job in the Carter administration, I described going fishing with friends and sitting around the campfire afterwards and discussing the bureaucratic politics and in Washington. And, I won this one, I lost that one, then I tricked them on this one and so forth. And I suddenly said, that's not the way I want to be. And there's nothing like fishing to humble you because you don't always win.
That's such a great lesson. And that's really, I mean, there's any number of reasons why I hope this gets assigned. I mean, we talked about this a couple of years ago. Texas National Security Review published your magnificent piece on ethics, which I know has been used, ethics in policy and ethics in international affairs. And it's just very clear from reading this that it's not just something you write about, it's something that you actually live, which has to be challenging because the way I see it, there's three worlds that you've been extraordinarily successful in. Obviously, you're a professor, you're a scholar, you're an intellectual, and I want to get to that in a moment. You're also someone who's had keen policy experience, both inside of government, but even when you've been an academic, not far from the action. You've also been, I would argue, your hardest job was actually running a school, which I think is, and I want to get to in a minute. But Alexander George used to talk about it as bridging the gap, and I don't think anyone's done it more successfully than you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you came to think about it and how you think about it now, bridging the gap between these worlds.
Well, I am an admirer of Alex George. He was a friend, my senior, but I thought he was one of the scholars who was most interesting in terms of thinking about how the real world related to first class history in his case. And to my mind, the most interesting difference between government work and academic work, there are two differences actually. One is time. If you're writing an article for a referee journal, you may keep polishing it and polishing it for years before you say, now this is going to be, worthy of a referee journal. If you're in government and you're preparing a memo for the president to prepare him for a meeting with a foreign minister of another country, and you have this thing up to a sort of an A minus at noontime, and you keep polishing it, and finally you get it up to an A or an A plus, but it doesn't get to the White House until, or the president's desk until 4 p.m., and the meeting was at 3 p.m., it's an F. So time is a huge difference between academic life and government life. And the other is obviously power. Well, we have power struggles in academia. It's not the same. I mean, if you develop a good idea and you want to make sure that it goes ahead or is accepted, you don't recruit a coalition to promote the idea. You hope to publish it or get it presented at professional associations, whatever. So there's some promotional element to it. But in government, if you have an idea and it's a good idea, but you can't recruit a coalition to move it forward, then it's not much value at all. It's value to you, but it's not having an impact on policy. So time and politics or political coalition building, I think are two very different processes in academia and government. And I hoped in the book to draw that out and to illustrate why there's a gap that needs bridging.
I think you do that very effectively. And I want to draw on a thread that I listened to several interviews and read a few reviews of the terrific book. And I didn't see this pulled on, but it's something I'm very interested in. Just like Bill Burns' memoir, you're very, very nice. But I want to put you on the spot a little bit on this. And that is, there's sort of an implied critique. Well, there's an explicit critique and an implied critique of the social sciences. And you're one of these generous scholars who goes to meetings of the International Studies Association. You have that great discussion with Bob Cohane where you say you're not going to go anymore. And he says, no, the young people need to see you. But you've been involved in universities for a long time. I don't think we're in a particularly great moment in higher education. Your own school and the University of Harvard's had a rough year. In fact, our mutual friend Tarek Masood, who's had ran this great series up at the Kennedy School, came to me and talked about what immense you were defending him this year when few others, when he held that difficult conversations on the Middle East situation. And I guess you've been involved in universities. You also used their ideas. You've created ideas and you've led schools. What needs to be done? How do things need to be fixed so that universities better follow your lead, both in terms of bridging the gap, in terms of engaging public discussion? What would you diagnose the issues to be? What did you see when you were running the Kennedy School? What needs to be done? What's your, and again, I know you're too nice to come down too hard on people or institutions, but what is your assessment of where we are in higher education?
Well, I think you're going through a rough spell now. I agree with you. There's a lot of internal division about issues like diversity and so forth. And then there's also a lot of external pressure, as we've seen in the aftermath of the Gaza war and the atrocious attack on Israel. But it doesn't fit the university to just become another pressure group in society. We're never going to be the most powerful pressure group. And so, in that sense, maintaining a degree of distance, I mean, you can be critical, but as an institution, you don't want to take political positions. I recount in the book a conversation during the Vietnam period with a professor of philosophy at Harvard who was 10 years older than I. And he said, we have to march. This is like Germany in the 1930s. And Lyndon Johnson is a terrible person. And I said, I'm not in favor of the war, and I am happy to join a group which goes to Washington to protest against it. But we don't want to corrupt our position in the university by just becoming a pressure group against the war. And the same thing is true today. On the reason I defended Tariq Masood, who was bringing in Palestinians as well as Israelis to discuss the problem, was that's what universities should do. And the danger is that because of outside pressure or internal pressure, we hear only one side of the story. So I think the biggest problem that we face is to keep close to our basic mission, which is to be that rare part of society where truth matters.
Great message. And I hope people take that away. And I swear I'm going to get to your ideas, but this is kind of a little obsession of mine. Reading the book, you were a very successful dean. And I've had good fortune of have some, quite a few deans at policy schools and schools of international affairs. And it is a hard job. It is a difficult job. And to be honest, as I kind of think of the deans I've had, probably more have failed than succeeded. There's some great successes in there, including our mutual friend, Jim Steinberg, who's a terrific dean. but it's a really hard job. And I guess what were the keys to your success? And if a young person, you have a new dean coming in at Harvard, a terrific guy, Jeremy Weinstein, and hopefully he'll come and seek advice from you. But what would you tell a person who was in one of these academic leadership positions? What did you learn, and what advice would you give them? Because these are really important positions, but they're really hard.
You're right. And I also agree with you about both Jim Steinberg and Jeremy in terms of their qualities. But when I came to the Kennedy School, what struck me was that it was doing well in the sense of it was ranked high in the magazine ratings and so forth. But the question is, was it achieving its mission? And there was a danger, I thought, that we would look at the test scores of the incoming students and say, well, those are very high, but that would be simply because of the label Harvard. Or we would look at the quality of the faculty and say, oh, they're great citation records and so forth. But that again would be because of the label. And the question was, were we doing something which was central to our mission, which was to relate policy ideas, to transfer them to a new generation of public leaders, young people, and at the same time present them in a way that was relevant to improving policy. So I likened it to walking a tightrope, which was the dean's job of a place like the Kennedy School was to keep the faculty, many of whom would be quite happy to go and do their own thing and not be bothered by the dean or by mission statements, to keep them on that rope with me. The danger is, on the one hand, if you got pulled over into too much of an academic approach, you were just repeating the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And we already had one of those. And if, on the other hand, you were pulled over in the opposite direction into profit making businesses, then we already had a business school. So the question was, how did you move toward this objective of creating public value and transferring it to a younger generation? And that, to my mind, was the role of the dean, to keep reminding people that that's what we're about.
That's a really good insight. And I want to remind our audience who might not be in the academic world that this is much harder than it seems. As you were talking, I was reminded of the California Berkeley Chancellor Kerr, who once said that the Berkeley faculty were a series of independent contractors bonded by a shared sense of grievances over parking. And the idea of what you were doing that you so successfully pulled off, I think, I mean, I'm going to get to all your other accomplishments soon, but in some kind of hidden way, when I was reading your book, I thought he's done a lot of really important things intellectually, but wow, I mean, it's not like Harvard Kennedy School faculty self-select as low ego personalities, and you handled it brilliantly. So I would advise anyone out there who's thinking about pursuing an academic management or leadership career to get in touch with Professor Nye. But you didn't just do that, right? We know a lot of really good deans. I am struck by, and I kind of want to talk about the marketplace of ideas here. A person is lucky, a scholar is lucky if they have one major concept associated with them. And you have at least two. I'm thinking, of course, years ago when you really made the term interdependence and the concept of interdependence one of the kind of fundamental conceptual lenses of understanding globalization in an increasingly interconnected world. And it's just become part of our lingo. And you didn't stop there. Several decades later, you come up with this concept of soft power, which, of course, is globally recognized everywhere. I would love to know, and I'm sure our audience would love to know, how you developed each. And, if you want to give away your secrets about, obviously, you're incredibly smart, these are good ideas, but we all know for the marketplace of ideas, to have two concepts like this become really part of our everyday conceptual apparatus and lingo, that's pretty remarkable. How did you do it? Like, what's the secret?
I think the important thing for younger scholars who are asking, how do I do this? The advice I give is follow your curiosity. I got into the field of international politics through the back door, the side door. I did my PhD thesis in East Africa because I was intrigued by the question of whether the countries of Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania could hold together the common market that the British had bequeathed to them, which made great economic sense, but ran against the nationalism and pressures that were part of why they were becoming independent in the first place. So I turned, in seeking to try to understand that, I turned to integration theory, which was then being developed because of the success of European integration. But then I asked, how does it have to be adapted to fit the conditions of developing countries? And that led me to thinking about how politics and interdependence works out in practice. And then I had the good fortune of working with Bob Cohane, my co author, and we first did a book on transnational relations and world politics. And then after that, we said that's not enough. We've got to look at what's the matter with the traditional liberal view of interdependence that produces peace and goodwill, sort of the Kantian tradition. And that led us to write this book, Power and Interdependence, which basically said sometimes interdependence can increase the costs of going to war. Other times it can become a weapon, particularly if it's asymmetrical. And that we have to think about power and interdependence in a different way. It'll depend on different structural situations. And we develop a concept called complex interdependence, where states aren't the only actors and force isn't their only means and security isn't their only goal. And that fits some parts of world politics, like Europe. Doesn't fit at all in other areas like the Middle East. But we basically, sometimes people call this neoliberalism because it was taking the liberal tradition of thinking about interdependence, but complexifying it or making it relevant to different situations. So that's an example of one thing leading to another in terms of curiosity rather than sitting down and trying to think of what's a new idea. The interaction between the real world and trying to understand the world and explain it, I think, is crucial. On soft power, I was trying to understand why I thought Paul Kennedy, the great British historian, was wrong in saying the United States was going the way of Philip II Spain. And his book had become a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. And so I did a sort of an assessment of American military power and then of American economic power. And I said, but there's still something missing. And it's that ability to get others to do what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. And then I tried to think through how you would explain this. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table with pads of yellow paper and drawing 2x2 matrices and various continua of spectrums and so forth. And I finally decided the best way to use to summarize this is soft power, which is almost an oxymoron, but it's a different form of power that too often is neglected because it's hard to count and it often takes longer to have an effect. And as I say in the book, nothing could have surprised me more than when Hu Jintao, the Chinese president, told the 17th Congress Party, the Chinese Communist Party, in 2007, that China needed to invest more in its soft power. That's come a long way from my yellow pads in the kitchen.
Yeah, it's just a tremendous story and a great model for the young scholars out there. And again, this was your world of ideas, but you've got this great policy background, state, defense, the Nick. But you worked on an issue in the Carter administration, which I don't, yeah, I sometimes dabble a little bit in nuclear stuff. And I don't think reading your description on this, and I remember actually reading memos of yours from the Carter Library, that working on nuclear proliferation and nonproliferation in the late 70s. It was a volatile time, right? We kind of accept the sort of stability of the nuclear nonproliferation regime today. But the period you were in, there was declining American power, civilian nuclear energy all around, which could potentially slip over into military uses, a sort of a potential proliferation in a variety of places, even among allies like South Korea and Taiwan and places like that. How did you come to that position, being in charge and working on this issue, and sort of what are the lessons that people should be going back and looking at that period and examining?
Well, I think the if recapturing the atmosphere on proliferation in the early 70s, it was rapidly becoming what John F. Kennedy predicted the 70s would be, a world of 25 nuclear weapon states. And this became particularly true after the Arab oil embargo, which drove up oil prices, quadrupled them, made long gas lines, and people said, oh, well, we're going to have to turn to nuclear, and we're going to need 600 reactors by the end of the century, and there's not enough uranium, so we're going to have to reprocess plutonium from the spent fuel. And the problem with this, of course, is in a plutonium economy is an economy based on weapons usable materials. So the question is, how could we change people's thinking on this? In addition to that, you had particular cases, such as the French provision of a reprocessing plant to Pakistan, or the German sale of an enrichment plant to Brazil, and others that we felt would set a very bad precedent. And so, on the first issue, we created something called an international nuclear fuel cycle evaluation to ask questions like how much uranium was there? Was it really more economic to reprocess plutonium? How did we safeguard the plutonium if we did reprocess it? And by having a 2 year program, which was staffed not just by atomic energy commissions, but by foreign office and security people, we got a better perspective on what the crisis was, or how urgent the crisis was, and how better to keep nuclear energy, which we favored, from spilling over into nuclear weapons, which we obviously were against. And on the hard cases, that was a little bit more like traditional diplomacy, in which you try to use a variety of incentives to persuade other governments to change their policies. I think one of the interesting things, though, is we eventually got the French to change their sale of a reprocessing plant to Pakistan. But the thing that caused it was not refusing to sell planes or saying that we put up tariffs on French goods or whatever. It was, I was able to provide my French counterparts with information. We had intelligence showing that the Pakistanis were planning to use it for nuclear weapons. And one of the French officials said to me, if Andre Giraud, who later became their Minister of Defense, said, if this is true, we will have to change our position. But if you say this to the press and embarrass us, we won't. And so the harder thing there was not to get it into the press. But it's interesting that it wasn't arm twisting as much as it was provision of ideas, and in this case, intelligence, which was persuasive.
That's really interesting. And I, again, for the people in the sort of nuclear studies community, the work Joe did during this very critical time is extraordinarily important. You also had what I personally consider the coolest job in the US government, which is being chair of the NIC, the National Intelligence Council. I've gotten to hang out with the NIC on occasion, use their reports in teaching. And I actually do think it's the coolest job going. Maybe you could tell our audience a little bit about what the NIC is, what it does, what your role was, what you kind of learned and brought to it while you did it.
Well, the National Intelligence Council prepares intelligence estimates for the president. That means that at that time, the 16 intelligence agencies in the government come together and agree that this is a net assessment. They can take footnotes in which they say an agency can say we don't agree with the consensus, but the policymaker, rather than hearing 16 different views, says, well, 13 out of 16 say this and 3 say the opposite, and here's why the difference is there. So it was a fascinating job because you had access to extraordinary amounts of information, and then trying to get people to get a common report, a national intelligence estimate, out of these discussions was an interesting job in itself. So I loved the Nick job, and it's a great organization. The one thing that I didn't love about it is that you have to keep your mouth shut on policy issues. So I would go to meetings at the Situation Room in the White House, and after you give the intelligence briefing, and the rest of the people in the room are pressing and shouting and pushing for this policy or that policy, you have to listen like a good Victorian child to be seen but not heard. And I felt that there were things that were wrong in American Asian policy, particularly the way we were thinking about Japan, which we saw as a threat, and we're trying to break the US Japan security alliance. And that was very short sighted in terms of not realizing that China was going to be a major question in the future. So I wanted to change the policy on that. But when I was sitting in these rooms as the chairman of the NIC, I had to keep my mouth shut. And that's why I accepted Bill Perry's invitation to go across to the Pentagon and become Assistant Secretary of Defense, because there I could actually put my hands on the levers and build coalitions and argue for policy changes. And over a couple of years, we got the policy changed.
It brings up a very important issue, which is hotly debated among scholars, which is the extent to which intelligence is apolitical. We all know during the Bush administration, especially with intelligence towards Iraq, it becomes politicized. There was stuff in the 70s with strategic nuclear forces that became politicized. On the other hand, your description of sort of a just the facts, ma'am kind of approach doesn't necessarily seem like it accords with reality. When you think about that relationship between intelligence and policy, is there a sweet spot that you would find for it?
You have to be careful not to politicize intelligence because then you're corrupting the basis of the system. But you have to ask, how can I make intelligence more relevant or useful? When I became Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, I would put on the calendar once every week or two something that I called intelligence briefing. And I would ask that all my deputy assistant secretaries attend. And what it was I bring in the intelligence people. And I'd say the topic today is, let's say, North Korea. And after I hear their first intelligence briefing on North Korea, I say, okay, now what does that mean for us in policy? And then the various policy people would say this, that, or the other thing. Then I would turn and I would ask the intelligence people, if we did X, what would likely follow? Or if we did X plus 2, what would likely follow? Then the intelligence people could respond in terms of policy because they were asked. And so the policy maker has to find ways to use intelligence more effectively. And that was an example of how I did it. And the important part about putting it on the calendar was your calendar to get so jammed so quickly and you're basically drinking from a fire hose that unless you put something like this on the calendar and you reserve it weeks in advance, it ain't going to happen. And occasionally you had to cancel it at the last minute because of some crisis comes along. But at least it got a chance for the policy people to interrogate the intelligence people and allow them then to say, if you do that, here's what we think would happen.
So, one really kind of final set of questions or reflections from you. One of the things I really liked about the book was that you weave in the contemporary history, international history, American foreign policy history with your own life. And throughout it, you make a very clear case for the benefits of American global leadership. That's clearly under challenge right now. We're about to face a fairly consequential election, presidential election in November. One of the things that's really good about the book and your story that you told about Vietnam was to remind young people things may seem rough now, but we've seen rough patches before. What I'm wondering is how worried are you right now about the United States, its future, and its role in the world? Where do you see the United States going? I know that you're not a soothsayer, but I guess given your deep historical background, what you've seen, how do you assess the current moment?
Well, I am worried, but I think one of the things about that I tried to illustrate in the book, one of the things about going through a longer time horizon is to instead of thinking of things as linear, they you put more attention to cyclical explanations and also a greater role for uncertainty. Sometimes people would say to me in the last year or so about Harvard, have you ever seen things so bad at Harvard as they are now? And I'd say, yes, worse. In the 1960s and early 70s, a bomb went off in my building and it was ransacked 3 or 4 times, and a staff member was sent to the hospital. I said, tent encampments are quite different from bombs. Doesn't mean that we're not going through a bad spell now, but if you chart the ups and downs of American role in the world, it is more cyclical than a straight secular line up or down. If you think of it in terms of just measured by public opinion polls like the Pew poll or Gallup poll, the United States loses its attractiveness in the Vietnam period. It regains it in the 70s and early 80s. And the 90s, we're doing quite well. After the invasion of Iraq, we lose it again. Then Obama is elected. And I remember a British politician saying to me, you amazing Americans, he said, you were the most unpopular people in the world. Then you elected an African American president and you've suddenly regained your soft power. And so it goes up again under Obama, then it goes down again under Trump. The attitude of America first applies everybody else is second, then the various withdrawals from things like the Iran nuclear agreement or the Paris climate accords. This makes us quite unpopular. It goes back up somewhat under Biden, but there's a good deal of uncertainty of whether Trump will come back. And so if you plot those answers to polls over several decades, do you find the United States attractive or not? You'll see the cyclical pattern that I talked about. If I have to guess about the future, and I conclude the book with this, that I have a guarded ray of optimism, which is based on the resilience of the society and the fact that we have overcome such bad things in the past that I suspect we would overcome another 4 years of President Trump's policies that were so unpopular around the world at the end of the 16 to 20 period. But I can't be sure, and nobody can be sure. And that's why I'm worried.
It's a somewhat daunting, but I think probably an appropriate point to end our conversation. I could not recommend this book highly enough, particularly for younger people who are both looking to find a way to make a difference in the world, to understand a complicated world, who have some of the current concerns that we discussed and want to be able to try to make a difference because few people have had the kind of impact that Joe has had, both in the world of ideas, the world of action, the world of leadership, and all while doing it with, as far as I can tell, being an absolutely lovely and wonderful human beings. So this is, for the young people out here, this is really a great guide. So Joe, thank you for this book. Thank you for all you've done. And thank you for joining us today on Horns of a Dilemma.
Well, thank you very much, Frank. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at TNSR.org.